I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Carl Schmitt's Dictatorship. Today, we're continuing the second part of Chapter 3, which deals with, Chapter 3 was focused on the question of what he says, the transcription of the sovereign dictatorship in the 18th century state theory. In other words, this idea of this transition of the concept of sovereign dictatorship, the idea, and here is that it's the idea of the state, the idea of statecraft, and what is meant by state power and state executive in that sense. And the focus so far in the first part was mostly on from looking at the origin of the centralized state in France through Louis the XIV's centralization of authority in the absolutist state, then Montesquieu's critique of it, Montesquieuan theory of state theory that deals with division of powers, and then the way then the Enlightenment thinkers, the physiocrats and the other, like Voltaire, as alternative to so that therefore there's this presentation of Voltaire and the physiocrats as kind of an alternative towards this Montesquieuan kind of idea of state, which was not in other words, Montesquieu's account of the state, of the monarchy, was arguing for intermediary systems, not an absolute state. It was the state of the monarchy of that he talks about. Montesquieu talks about in Spirit of Love is a mediated body. It's a moderated body, which is completely contrary and criticism of what Louis the XIV's centralized state and absolute state tends to be. So therefore, there is this critique, and then the Enlightenment thinkers who kind of embrace the absolutist state, but for rationalist reasons, right? Then he explains the idea of the Enlightenment thinkers, particularly starting with Voltaire and many of the physiocrats who argue for their way, and the critique of physiocrats. Now, we kind of left at that separation of powers and a discussion of separation of powers, and we'll continue right now, looking at this where we left off. Again, we're going to be looking at pages 92 to 111, and this starts off with right here, this paragraph. This dictatorship of reason was rooted in the distinction between the enlightened philosopher and the people who needed to be enlightened. This distinction obscured one of the consequences that were obvious for the mental state of that time, and prevented one from drawing conclusion based on natural law that all authorities of the state stem from the will of the people. Hence, the absolute power of the single ruler depends on it being formally transmitted by the people. And this is again, that's Hobbes, right? This is the logic. In other words, the enlightened philosopher was doing through this Hobbesian logic. Well, but the reality is the princes didn't think it this way, right? Because the greatest historic precedent, the Lex Regina, by which Caesar was given powers, took the form of a permanent dictatorship with Caesar, it was possible for the ruler to appear as a dictator. So given that the Lex Regina of the Roman Empire, or that rise of Caesars, were given powers and given permanent dictatorship, right? This appeared that this was possible. This rule of Caesar was a permanent dictatorship. In the 18th century, however, this was not treated systemically, but mentioned in sporadic fashion. In other words, in Hoelzl's memoirs pour les peuples français. Okay, this is memoirs of the memory of the people, of the French people, published anonymously in 1788. Curiti was assistant to the young Mirabeau. This book was seeking to bind democracy and monarchy against the privileged classes and make monarchy into in other words, the dictator perpetual and hereditary de la Republique. In other words, the permanent and hereditary dictator of the republic, monarchy in that sense. 37, this is from the book, and tells it. He goes, Joseph Corelli's The Memoir of the People on page 70 in the copy held by State Bibliothèque in Berlin. See also the king as the king as the mandatory of the nation versus le despot of the classes and the dominant classes. Despotism of the ruling classes, right? The dominant classes or ruling classes. The despotism des la classe dominante, the despotism of the ruling class, dominating classes. This is the opposition, the idea of dictator of the people, dictate and hereditary of the people versus a despotic rule, right? This is the idea in the book. So, um, uh, uh, even among representatives of radical forms of economics and social equality, we can find a the existing immediate intermediate powers and the politically organized interests of the estates and the classes demanded a strong central power. So even this, in other words, even among representatives of the radical economic forces, the conviction that the existing intermediate powers and the political organized interests of the estates and classes demanded a strong power, centralizing power. With that came the belief that the state and the unlimited potential of political, in other words, with that came the belief in the state and in the unlimited potential of political means, idea of state, the unlimited power of the state. Again, with the Hobbesian line, this Hobbesian state, this omnipotent entity, right? It became the belief in the state and the unlimited potential of political means of the state in that sense, right? Morally, the code de la nation, the code of nations, right? The natural code, the code of nations, right? 1775. Um, 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 in other words, the title is the Code of Nations and the Spirit of the Laws, right? Um, the Ode of Nature or the True Spirit of the Law. No, it's not the Code of Nature. Yeah, the Code of Nature or the True Spirit of the Laws. Saying about is the full title. Edited by Elwad Dolines, Paris, 1910 edition. The quotation is given above is taken from page 98 of this edition. Okay, so um, Morley's the code of nature, which is the spirit of law, right, was the first political treatise to explicitly to state explicitly that a human being was by nature good and was only corrupted by existing property relations and social and stately affairs. In other words, he was corrupted by property relations. In other words, he's again. This is like Rousseau. Rousseau. This is when does Rousseau? Rousseau's second discourses. Let me just get the date. Rousseau's second discourse is it's published around the same time. So the question is, was it early? Yeah, 1755. Rousseau's famous book where he talks about property that's inequalities based upon this natural aspect of having this, right? The discourse on the origin and base of equality among men, the second discourse, 1755. And it was published, it was work written in 1754, but it was published in 1755. And it didn't win the award, right? This is that. But this is interesting that there's, instead of pointing out, what is interesting, Schmitt, instead of pointing to Rousseau, points to Morley's book, The Code of Nature. Interesting, a book that we don't really read and pay attention to. That this was the first political treatise to state explicitly that a human being was by nature good and that only corrupted existing property relations and the societal and safety affairs. And it introduced the ideal state it introduced in the ideal state chefs, heads of departments, who, in the case of emergency, did with absolute authority whatever they considered to be appropriate, and who, in fact, were only ideal intendants. So this is the intendants, this idea of the departments, of a rational department. For Morley, despotism was only a means to realize the ideal conditions of equality. The state was an almighty pedagogue, and it is already, as it had been for enlightened philosophers, and the Jesuit state in Paraguay was an example of the concrete possibility of that Platonic idea of the communist state of philosophers could be realized. So therefore, the example of Paraguay. Oh my God, the Jesuit state in Paraguay. Oh my God, that's right. Forget about that little monstrosity, right? Why Paraguay to this very day is a screwed up place. Gabriel Bonnet de Mabie, on the other hand, was aware of the theory of counterbalance that made such an absolutism impossible. He also knew that a strong monarchy would abolish the rule of a class, social or political party, a class, a social class, or a political party, a party. He also wanted to use this strong state in order to establish the universal equality that would eliminate the domination of greed and the lust of powers. In other words, private property, and would make the contemporary state corrupt, the state of corruption, at least approximate the stat de la nature, the state of nature. According to him, this was only possible through an accurate consideration of human nature and its passions. But the political instrument was not simply the dictatorship of what was obviously right to the dictator. Malby had made extensive critical comments against Mercer de la Riviere's book and his system of despotism, legal despotism. So therefore, Mercer de Riviere's book of legal despotism, this is that he talked about. Gabriel Bonnet de Mabie doubts and proposed to economist philosophers on the natural and essential orders of society in the complete works of Gabriel de Mabie, edited by Peter Friedman in volume 11. The citation on the duties of the lawgiver given before can be found in volume 9 of this edition of Malbury's work. Okay, volume 9, pages 92, 155, and 170. Okay, so therefore this is very interesting in that sense of this Mabie's position. So Mabie, and then who before Mabie was again Morley. I'll talk about this again. Morley was 38. Is Inteli Gabriel Morley. Intete Gabriel Morley, the code. So therefore, that's these two authors, Galbraith and Morley, and then Morley, and then Gabriel de Mente, on the other hand, was aware of the theory of counterbalance and absolutely impossible. So therefore, this was this interesting situation. And tied here, Mably made a critical critique against Mercer's royal book and the system of legal despotism. Above all, he was skeptical about the power of philosophy, which philosophers were taking for granted. For him, the dictating evidence was anything but evident. So therefore, again, Malbury argued that no. Sorry, this idea of this dictating evidence of philosophy. The philosophy is going to have this automatic logic and reason is going to work. It's not evident. In other words, anything but evident. The philosophers were wrong if they thought that this evidence was placed like a god in his machine prop on the stage of the theater, the machine prop, or on the stage of a theater. Undu dan saw the machine and directed affairs. And the God was like, it was that the philosopher was that God of, sorry, my throat is like, there was that, the philosopher was like on like a god on a machine prop that just directed affairs. A human being was not an angel waiting to hear truth. Here was at work again what the classical teaching had handed down about the relation between the affairs, effects, and reason. Passions confuse people and are more convincing than the philosophic truth. From here, Mowbray derived the view, which was not alien to this tradition, that the bad emotions translated in the bad emotions maintained and sustained private property. So this idea of Mowbray argument that, well, these bad emotions, passions, and these passions that block reason maintained and sustained private property. But at this point, a decisive reversal occurred. The absolute doctrine of the natural malice of human beings was shaken by the fact that the ruling people were also naturally driven by passions and ignorance. In consequence, everything depended on the creation of restraints and guarantees, and this should be achieved through the right distribution of political functions. So, okay. So, in other words, because in other words, the idea was that the elites weren't going to be any more rational than the people. Everyone is going to be driven by their passions. Because of this, you needed a system of that. In other words, that in their ignorances in that sense. So, in consequence, everything depended upon creation of restraints and guarantees that this would go through the process of those should be achieved through the right distribution of political process. The French in this line is, well, this line in French, which we'll just translate here, it says, it's about the establishing counterforces between the magistrates so that we are not victims of the ignorance and passions of magistrates. Okay, that's a good translation. In other words, it is about the counterforces between the magistrates so that we're not victims of the ignorance. And that sounds like Madison, right? This almost perfectly sounds like Madison, Art Madison and Federalist 10 is arguing. So maybe he's kind of, maybe he's getting this idea from Mabby, right? In this sense, but the idea that force checks force, right? It is all a matter of counterbalance between various kinds of public service, so not to fall prey to the ignorance and passions of the public servants, the magistrates, right? The reversal of the absolute doctrine of the natural malice of human beings operated here by Mowbray preceded Rousseau preceded Rousseau in point of making a political impact insofar as Rousseau's social contract, which was published in 1762, did not mention the idea of natural goodness of humankind, which was to become so famous. It followed from Mabry's reversal that government and states were necessary evils, which needed So therefore, this idea, it followed from Mabry's reversal that government and states were necessary evils, which needed to be limited as much as possible. This was most obvious in America, right? This is the idea. This American experience of this is Paine, right? That governments are least evil. Thomas Paine produced a statement that, while fully reflected the spirit of North American liberalism, was phrased in such a way that it could have stemmed from in a way that it could have stemmed from 19th century, when state and society were conceived as separate entities, and the state appeared as a mechanical apparatus superimposed on the organically flourishing society. Society is the product of the rational coexistence of human beings, their needs, and satisfaction of those needs. The state, which of course Paine called government, is the result of our vices. Okay, 40 is not common sense, right? Common sense addressing habits following the subject of 76 by this is the Cameric edition, right? That's available. Malby had not gone that far, but with respect to the authority of the state, he had the same intention as the Americans. to establish a system of mutual controls and dependency, the so-called separation of powers, right? This is an idea of more powerful separation of powers. In other words, they wanted to create, this is, that was intended what Madison will argue. Okay, we're having a fight here. I wonder what's going on. It's slowing down. It's there. Okay, sorry. So Mabry didn't go as far as Paine, right? But he had the same intention. He had the same intention as Paine in that sense, the Americans, and echoing the Federalist Papers, like what happened in the Federalist Papers. That the idea of state and society, state and government is apparatus that impose upon the society, right? So therefore, this is interesting in that sense. He goes, what? The so-called separation of powers, right? He goes, is going to be the mechanism by which you can mutual control and dependencies. Ancient Rome, England, of course, only incompletely, the German Reich, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and above all Sweden were examples of such balanced powers. Nevertheless, according to Mabry, the danger always subsisted that the respective owners of actual instruments of state power, the executive, as he called it, may try to subdue the other powers by virtue of a natural lust for dominance. So therefore, the executive, in other words, for Malby, that it was going to be the balance of power because of it's going to be there. But the danger is that the executive was going to be who held the actual instruments of state power, government, would try to dominate the rest because his natural lust for dominance, right? Of course, even a direct democracy is a kind of despotism. The people are ignorant, but their government devolves into anarchy when it leads again to a need for magistrates with extraordinary authority. In other words, which then leads to, in other words, anarchy that leads to some order, to restore order. So therefore, democracy is a thinks the people are ignorant, their government dissolves in anarchy, and then we need powerful magistrates to restore order, right, with extraordinary authorities. But the most important issue, which his mistrust of, but the most important issue was his mistrust of the executive. So Malby has a massive distrust of the executive. Malby recognizes the fight against the king's commissioners, intendants, bracas, Turkish administrators, in their respective provinces. He even approved of it, that resisting of the king measure. Against the Jesuit state, he raised the objection that the Jesuits would have done better to educate the Indians in self-government, so as to enable them to elect officers for their economic administration of the republic from among themselves. This is Malbury's complete work, volume 4, page 8. Malbury's statement completely quoted previously. See volume 11, page 235, volume 9, page 138, volume 15, page 115 and 244. So therefore, he would have been better not to create a perfectly powerful executive and benefit. We should have been taught the Indians the principles of self-government to be able to then they themselves are able to elect officers. Against the philosophical economist fantastism, against the economist phantasm about the idea of unity, their unity of strength and will, right? Their fantasies of this idea of unity, the unity of force and will. Right? He raised the question of whether a philosopher could imagine that political unity would be created when property and living would be created when property and the entire living condition were unequal, and political power only served to maintain this inequality. Right? This is 42. This is volume 4, page 296. One might be reminded of the Marxist theory of the state when coming across such comments in Malbury and others, which suggest that political reforms were fruitless without the abolition of private property, regardless of genuine means of power that creates inequality. Nevertheless, even leaving aside Mowbray's Spartan idea of society, the difference remains essential because Mowbray cannot overcome his abstract rationalism. Mowbray does, in other words, he cannot overcome his abstract rationalism. The great hindrance to a correct understanding of the essence of society was, in his view, the method, which always begins with a subordinate element, the parties subaltern, subalterns, the parties subaltern, okay, this is subaltern parties, subordinate parts, okay, the subordinate parts, the subordinate elements, subordinate parties, like trade, finance, war, police, and commerce. The subordinate entities of trade, finance, war. In other words, his method was which began with subordinate things like trade, finance, war, police, commerce. For Mowbray, the correct examination of these elements remains dependent on predetermined principles, according to which the matter is categorized, whether one is aware of them or not. Those principles must be recognized in their pure form, but one should not get stuck in the details. Right? The details. Crawl in the details. Should not get stuck in crawl and get bogged up in the details. So they're important, but be careful. They're detailed. But then the systemic principles. So this abstract thinking. This is you can see. We can see in the progressive. This is maybe why there's a. Schmitt is pointing to something here. There is the reformers, the Enlightenment reformers who looked at this and looked at will share with the Marxists a kind of attack on the system, attack on private property. In fact, the difference is the Marxist system is different. Has a different logic than here, but there's still kind of a shared hostility towards private property is the problem. It's caused by irrationality and the injustice of the system. Sorry, hiccup. Boom. The free self-governance of the citizens consists in their participation in the legislative. So in the legislative, the executive must be divided from time to time according to different branches of administration. Otherwise, an accumulation of powers emerge. A magistrate universal magistrate, in other words, a despot. So therefore, the danger of executive, you have to change it, you have to move it, you have to alter it, because otherwise what will happen is all power will centralize in there, will become a universal despot in that sense, universal magistrate universal will emerge, that the power will centralize in that sense, and therefore there will be omnipotent and a despot. Regular control of government by particular commissions of the legislature are necessary. Even a yeah, pardon. Um, in other words, particular commissions of the legislature are necessary. Even a recurring year of reform undertaken periodically is recommended, and a very strict control is to be exercised during this time. Apparently, Mowbray did not realize that the institution exercising control was transformed into the executive organ at the very moment when its control began an effective control of the instrument, right? Sachen control, in other words, and that the despotic accumulation of power that ought to have been prevented would occur at that point too. So therefore, this is Schmitt points out a contradiction. All these universal things, but then the problem is Mowbray apparently didn't realize the second that this body that does reform and has all the power to do it becomes a despotic party of power, that the despotic accumulation of power that ought to have been prevented reoccurs at that point. This is very annoying. I don't know what's going on with the. I hope it's not going to be like this in the video. So let's see what happens. But in practice, this was the most significant. This was most significantly proved by the actions of the Jacobins, who were influenced by him. So the Jacobins, in other words, the Jacobins, Mowbray influenced the Jacobins. Well, we think that the Jacobins, Rousseau gets blamed for the Jacobins. Schmitt is suggesting that it's Mabry should be Mably, Malby should be the person that is blamed. They really influenced him, right? Uh, 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 and were influenced by him. The enmity towards the executive passed from Mowbray to the French Revolution. Referring to him, Robespierre said in the Constitutional Assembly of 18 May 1790 that only the legislature was allowed to decide on matters of war and peace, because it had the least interest in abusing its power, or as the king was inclined to such abuse. And he was armed de la puissance dictature quoi pour entraîner de la liberté, armed with a powerful dictatorship which can attack freedom. In other words, that can attack liberty. Right. Let's do the let's do it. Let's see Google Translate how it works. Armed with powerful dictatorship that can attack freedom, liberté. So that's the same translation. The work of the commissars of the National Convention started with controlling tasks, that is, with the actual interference of legislation in the minutiae of the executives. The first thing the commissars of the National Convention started was controlling tasks, the actual interference of legislation into the minutiae of the executive, driven only by the aim of guaranteeing an outcome, a given outcome. Surveillance expanded to the point where the activity under surveillance was completely absorbed. So therefore, what was originally designed, the surveillance of the administration, was designed to guarantee the outcome of the surveillance was they were expanded, so the activity of surveillance was completely absorbed in control, right? But here, the Jacobins complied with the suggestion made by Mabray in his Droit et devoirs of the citizen of 1754. So the laws and rights and duties of citizens, right? The rights and duties of citizens, where he said that during a revolution, the representatives of the people must be fully in charge of all business and must take up the executive functions themselves. So, yeah, this is one of those cases where Mabby is the man. Mabby is more important than Rousseau here, really, honestly. Schmitt is pointing out, again, this is where political theory may be bad for us because we don't always not told to whatever. This is where the Straussians who focus on Rousseau and not focus on Mabry pays no attention to Mabry. As a Straussian studying this, we would never be taught about Mabry. Maybe the Cambridge school would be better informed, maybe, but I'm not sure. I don't remember Cambridge people talking about this at all when I went to Cambridge people. So this is interesting that Schmitt is a more focused historically origins on the structures of this than even the Cambridge people. It's Cambridge school. Um, so therefore, but here the Jacobins complied with the suggestion made by Mabry in his book, The Rights and Duties of the Rights and Duties of Citizens, 1756, where he said that during the revolution, the representatives of the people must be fully in charge of all business and must take up the executive function themselves. Therefore, the people must be in charge of that, and the executive people control the executive function. So that it was what was later called. So it is that what was later called the Jacobin dictatorship of the National Convention was already anticipated by Malby. He reserved the name dictatorship, however, only for the Roman legal institution. Back then, stereotypical phrases were reiterated around it, as the article in the encyclopedia summarizes. The extraordinary conditions demanded extraordinary means. During dictatorship, the laws are silent. The power of the dictator is compensated by a limitation of time and so on. See Louis de Joncourt's article Diktatur en Derot en d'Amblets Encyclopédia of Dictionary, Encyclopedia ou Dictionary, Reason and Science. Okay, the dictionary, the encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia of Reason, or Reason Dictionary of Science, Arts, and Crafts, Volume 4. I think this is the edition that had Rousseau's. I think this is the edition that may have had Rousseau's political economy in it. The phrase the laws speak or are silent" was very popular at the time. We find it, for instance, in Montesquieu, where he claims that the judge is the mouthpiece of the law, and that in the comments made by Friedrich II of Prussia, I never decide. I decide never to disturb the course of the proceedings. It is in the law courts that the laws must speak and the king must be quiet. Again, this is the Act of Bosserola. Act Bosserola, Ecclesiastes and Civic Intura, or the careful connection of all sorts of news and certificates, writings, and the documents relating to the history of the state of Prussia. Right. This is 1732. For Mabry's view of Roman dictatorship, see his observance on the Romans, his complete works. Now, on Sulla on the perpetual dictator, and Sulla on the perpetual dictatorship, right? In that sense, his comments on Sulla. But Mabry stated that the dictator was more than a king, because the function of all other magistrates were nullified through his function. For Machiavelli, the continuing existence of the magistrates was in fact a guarantee against the abuses of dictatorship. By contrast, Mabry's understanding of this function reflects the transition to a new concept of dictatorship. It became an absolute power, overruling all existing authorities. This new idea, this Enlightenment idea that Mabry does, that it changes from the Machiavellian. The Machiavellian, the other offices remain, therefore those other offices are restrained of dictatorship. Here, the dictator even destroys all of those offices and overcomes everything. In other words, it becomes an absolute power over all existing authorities. No longer can we talk. No longer can we talk about. We can no longer. Sorry. No longer can we talk now about the supreme command over war and the crushing power, or about the crushing of uproar, which the standing conception of commissary dictatorship permitted. In order to justify dictatorship, Mabry claimed that it had to emerge because laws wear out every time, because laws wear out over time and corruption becomes too widespread. So dictatorships has to happen. It has to emerge because why? Laws wear out over time and corruption is too widespread. Obviously, the dictator appeared to him as a kind of commissar of reformation with unlimited powers over the entire constitutional organization of the state. If one combines Mabry's concept of dictatorship with his aforementioned statement that during a revolution, the representatives of the people must put themselves in charge of the executive, one arrives at the dictatorship that the National Convention exercised in the name of the people. This is no longer a commissary dictatorship of reformation, but a sovereign dictatorship of a revolution. So here, Schmitt now looks at what happens in the French Revolution and what the Jacobins do, and looking at its origins in Mabry's understanding of here, of taking two ideas from Mabry and combining them in that sense, creating the sovereign dictatorship in that sense. As in other respects, Rousseau was not unconditionally up to date as Mabry in this matter. Instead, if one puts his illusion in the context of the entire in other words, instead, if one puts his illusion in the context of the entire social contract, his construction of dictatorship announced the new concept of dictatorship by another reason. Rousseau Rousseau dictated to Dictatorship a whole chapter of the social contract, chapter 6, book 4, which begins with a number of traditional views begins with, and a number of traditional views are repeated here. So that on a superficial reading, this chapter in particular is at least to contain is the least to contain any novelty. But this impression changes on a systemic analysis, not so much on the account of the impact of the Bible of the Jacobins on the French Revolution, which was frequently exaggerated as on account of the chapter's actual as on account of the chapter's actual content. Moreover, this content was already enumerated by Rousseau's aphorisms. Moreover, this context was already enumerated by Rousseau's aphorisms. Hence, a in other words, that the social contract in this dictatorship, right, was already enumerated by Rousseau's aphorisms, his book Aphorisms. Hence, a thorough examination is in place. This contradictory book, the Contract Social, Social Contract, is best suited to reveal both the critical conditions of continental individualism and the exact point at which this individualism turns into state absolutism, and its demand for freedom turns into a demand for terror. So, therefore, this is very interesting. It says that this is not. It's not this. It's not this. It's that it is the moment that is in the how it's used. This book, Contract Social, and the contradictions in the social contract, is the best way to understand the movement from the condition, the critical condition of the continental individualism, and how that point where this individualism turns into state absolutism, and its demand for freedom turns into the demand for terror. Okay, so they're very Goethe in his Johannes Althusis, his Breslau 1880, quoting Althusis' book, Politica, right? He's one of Althusis' book is basically criticizing Baton in that sense, an idea against absolute monarchy and for kind of federative systems, right? Confederated systems, democratic, republic, constrained systems, intermediate bodies to intermediate powers, tells us that the starting point and purpose of the contracts. Okay, this is Goethe in his book on Johannes says this. That tells us the starting point and purpose of the social contract is the freedom of the individual. While the starting point was an unconditional, natural, and inalienable freedom of the individual, its purpose was presumed to be the same. A state should be created in which not one single person is enslaved, in which the individual does not have to sacrifice the smallest aspect of liberty. With a grand gesture, a great expectation was created in the social contract, and an answer was promised to a tremendous question, which had never been answered to that day, which is what? This line. In a form of association which defends and protects with all common force the persons and property of each associate by which each person united with all nevertheless obeys only himself and remains free as previously, right? So this is that translation of the French literally. This is the translation by the editor. To find a association defends and protects with all the collective powers the persons and goods of each member, and in which everyone, joining all the others, does not, however, obey anyone but himself and remains just as free as before. Book 1, Chapter 6 of Rousseau's Social Contract. Of course, the answer he gives is not in itself surprising. If everyone associated with everyone else only on the basis of free consent, then he is only obedient to himself and remains as free as before. In this case, it is evident that freedom cannot be the same. Freedom cannot be the same as independence. Otherwise, coexistence would be impossible. So, therefore, this is the problem. Right? This is the system would be, then coexistence would be impossible. So, independent cannot be. The freedom is not the same as independence. The essential thing must all. The essential thing must always be that the individual is only obedient to himself. Hence, the basic contract must always be entered upon unanimously. Otherwise, the majority can always compel the majority. Right? Volume 4, 4. In the forthcoming reference to Rousseau's social contract, the Roman numeral in the round brackets indicates the book, and the Arab numeral indicates the chapter, and the number separated from it is through a full stop indicates the passage. For Locke, so book that 7.2 in passage 7, there was book 4, chapter 2, and the 7th passage. For Locke, this was the derivative justification for the state. Was every decision of the state is a consequence of my consent to the state, of my own discretion. I have subjected myself to the majority. Second Treatise of Civil Government, Chapter 7, Section 38. Rousseau, on the other hand, seems to go beyond Locke's individualism, because for him there is no representative of the common free will. The English people are not free because they are governed by a parliament instead of being governed by themselves. Book 3, Chapter 15, Section 5, fifth section. Now, I'm going to stay here. This is Schmitt is reading Rousseau radically here, taking the logic, going even further. Roger Masters argues the opposite. So there's an interesting thing that Masters argues that maybe Schmitt may be misreading him, reading Rousseau here, or overstating Rousseau. But I can understand what Schmitt is doing. Schmitt is just taking the logic and expansion, seeing that at one level Rousseau is radicalizing Locke, therefore he's radicalizing Locke, right? In other words, Rousseau, on the other hand, seems to go beyond Locke's for individual, because for him there's no responsibility of the free common will. The English people were not free because they're governed by a parliament instead of being governed by themselves. Representation, right? Book 3. This is chapter 3. The sovereign will of the people cannot be represented any more than the people itself can. So he's reading it very literally. Schmitt is here. Which I would argue that you could maybe instead of arguing for the radical democratization, this is the radical understanding of this. But if you follow Rousseau's tendency, he's exaggerating a little bit. He's exaggerating. This is a case of Rousseau, I think, and I think this is a very interesting point here, that Schmitt is now reading like a German. If you read Rousseau like a German, you understand the literal words of this. If you read Rousseau, if you read like a Frenchman, you look for not the literality, because the French, German language is very precise. It's like this. The logic will follow. Therefore, it means what it says, and there's the logic and the grammar comes from this is the meaning, the greater meaning, and its precision. The German language is very precise. The French language, more flexibility. So therefore, you can exaggerate. You can, in fact, you exaggerate for effect. But you understand that that's not the real argument. The argument is maybe more limited in that sense. So therefore, there's something in Rousseau that sometimes Rousseau will overstate, show the style overcomes the subject, the sentence, the grammar, the style of what is presented says too much. But if you follow the logic of what has been said before, then you see, okay, you don't. No. It has to be interpreted in light of the whole. You interpret the whole, not the logic of that sense. This is how I understand. This is why I think there's a difference here. Schmitt is reading Locke very Germanically. And if you read Locke Germanically, then you will see his statement is exaggeration, not as an exaggeration, but as a literal position. In other words, there's no esotericism in Schmitt. In Rousseau, I think there is esotericism because there is exaggeration. There is this use of style exaggerates, and therefore you have to always look at Rousseau as kind of finding the logic of the system and seeing that sometimes something is said for effect, not, but it just exaggerates. It doesn't contradict. So, but therefore we should revert not to the exaggerate. We shouldn't divert from the trajectory of what has been argued so far. So therefore, seek consistency rather than take it to the new divergent position, right? So, okay, let's go continue. Right? See, there's no that goes beyond Locke's common will. Okay. The sovereign will of the people cannot be represented any more than the people itself can. So therefore, the sovereign will of the people cannot be represented any more than the people itself can. Thus, the dependence of the individual, as they existed in the estates and other intermediate corporations, disappears entirely. So that, in other words, the dependence of the individual, as existed in the estates and the intermediary corporations, disappears. The individual finally seems to become wholly and unconditionally free. He is confronted only and directly by the common will. So therefore, in other words, this is what it means. This is the point that I think this is the point Tocqueville gets. This is where I think Schmitt is right. That once you understand it this way, you see how this radical freedom destroys all the intermediary institutions. You are free. You are free in that sense. But then your freedom is then tied to the general will. And what is the general will? Is that total will and the total collective, and you feel it's your power is no longer power like this. It's your percentage of power based to the overall, and it's separation of like this, right? This is um, um, immediate corporation tied to spirit. The individual finally seems to be wholly and unconditionally free. He is confronted only and directly by the common will. Okay, so therefore he is this. But then again, I'm the individual. I'm free, right? Now I'm free. I'm free. I'm independent. But what happens? My will is confronted with a will that is the will of all these hundreds of thousands, and I'm just one against 100,000. So this is the situation that your freedom now all of a sudden the individual is crushed by the weight of the general will in that sense. Okay, now this is interesting in that sense. This reading of Rousseau shows the not the totalitarian character, but the way the power relationship overcomes it. Right? He says directly by the overcomer, the construction of the state. Sorry, no. The individual. I repeat this line. The individual finally seems to be wholly and unconditionally free. He is confronted only and directly by the common will. In the construction of the state, this was expressed in the fact that the state was no longer based on a subjection to some power and on a contract with this power. The contract of governance, the social contract, only contained an agreement. So that the agreement was the pact social is an agreement of everyone that makes this power, makes the common general will. So, like it says, let's repeat this line. Uh, um, in the construction of the state, this was expressed in the fact that the state was no longer based on a subjection to some power and on a contract with this power. The contract of governance, there was a contract of governance. No, this is no longer based on this, the contract of governance. The social pact only contains an agreement. Theories of the state that combine several contracts, agreement and subjugation, like that of Pufendorf, evaporate before the simple logic of this contract, which in Hobbes was only a contract of subjection, and in Rousseau, a contract of agreement. So, I mean, this is where I think Schmitt does a very good job. So, therefore, in other words, the theories of states that combine several contracts, agreements, and subjugation, like that of Rousseau, right, of Pufendorf. Pufendorf has different contracts. There's contracts of agreement and then contracts of subjection, of submission of authority with government entities, right? And these things. The social compact is only in a contract of agreement. It creates a general will in a sense, and that's what sovereignty is general will in that sense. What Hobbes does is evaporate. In other words, Hobbes, this logic, the logic of this evaporates of those. In other words, the combined things of someone like Pufendorf is destroyed by the simple logic of contract, of the logic of the simple contract, which in Hobbes was only a contract of subjugation, and in Rousseau that of agreement. So it's a unified contract, no simplicity, no intermediate structures, one of subjection, one is a subject, and the other one is of agreement. And in both cases, the result in the first instance was that the individual and the state were directly opposed to each other. So therefore, that is the case. In other words, it's in both cases, the individual and the state are directly opposed to each other. With this, in other words, so therefore, in both cases, the result in the first instance was the individual state were directly opposed to each other. With this, the state theory based on the individual reached their extreme point. So the state theories based on the individual reached their extreme point, right? In fact, Rousseau's theory significantly contributed to the transformation of France into a liberal civil state. So it destroys order intermediate. In other words, this is very interesting. That in fact, Rousseau's theory significantly contributes to what does it do? It's free. It's no longer it's associational. It's about agreement and association, not submission. Very interesting. So therefore, this is if you read Rousseau like a Hobbesian, you'd be. This is the problem with it. If you read Hobbes, if you understand Hobbes's argument as submission, and read it as a submission, then therefore what he does would be a different way. Schmitt is saying that we have to read Rousseau as talking about agreement, right? So with this, they theories based on the individual will reach their extreme point in that sense, right? So therefore, this the individual either submission or have to be totally free. In fact, Rousseau's theory significantly contributed to the transformation of France into a liberal civil state. But this system had one further implication. It concerns the basic meaning of the individual in that state. So therefore, the Rousseau thing gives you freedom, but it concerns the basic meaning of the individual in that state. The infinite contradictions that were possible within the so-called system of natural law and the superficial nature that he attempts to summarize them usually undergoes usually under one single label has already been touched upon. See page 17, right? This is where the contradiction shows its most far-reaching implication. In natural law, the starting point of the construction, the individual meant different things to different theorists. So therefore, this is the point, that the individual in here means different things to different theorists, right? Therefore, this is that natural law was pointing on the individual. Well, the individual itself means this, on the character of the initial provision, which was itself formal, depended on the political outcome. So the character of the initial provision, which was itself formal, depended on the political outcome. The extent to which the individualistic starting point was given a substantial content. So therefore, they were dependent on the outcome you want, right? To the extent to which the individual starting point was giving substantial content. How much in natural law, this is where you find the greatest contradiction that can ever exist in a theory of state. So in natural law, this is where the greatest contradiction can ever exist in a theory of state. There is only one natural law according to which the individual is a concrete reality, one that exists independently of any social organization and form, and therefore is in principle unlimited. In contrast to the state, which is essentially a limited entity. So therefore, this idea that there's one exists independently of any social organizations and form. So the individual natural law, where he is an individual complete reality, one exists independently of any other social. He's an individual, right? Of any forms, and therefore is in principle unlimited. In contrast to a state, which is a essentially limited entity. Sorry. Therein is there is another natural law according to which these relationships are reversed. In the natural law of science, as conceived by Thomas Hobbes, the individual person was a center of energy, and the state, the Leviathan, was the unity that consumed the singularity created by the eddy or vortex of the meetings of such atoms. So, okay, let's do this for a second. I hope I'm going to get shaved today because it's been bothering me. So what is he saying? Hobbes in science takes the individual actions as becomes like a starting point, and that the combining of this creates a vortex where the atoms, what we call, is a unity. The Leviathan was a unity that consumed the singularity created in the eddy of the vortex of such meetings of atoms. On the other hand, the natural law of justice upholds, even if in the deluded humanism, a concept of individuality that cannot be given a rationalistic form at all. So there, on the other hand, the natural law of justice upholds, right? Even if the deluded humanism, a concept of individuality that could not be given a rationalist form at all, right? It is a concept of individuality derived from Christian natural law, which reached its apex in Puritan Christendom. On this view, every individual is superior to any rational exposition or explanation, and therefore superior to any limitation and description, superior to any allocation of his or her value. The individual is the bearer of an immortal soul, created and redeemed by God alone. So therefore, okay, in other words, the logic of science leads you to this, but the Christian, this idea derived from Christianity, the Christian natural law, the idea of this immortal soul that's superior to anything above it, right? And that therefore the individual is bearer of an immortal soul created by God alone. The state and society, however, admit to rationalizations. So state and society, however, admit of rationalization. In fact, this essentially irrationality, this essential irrationality of the individual paved the way for the complete rationalization of the social order. But the principle of distribution among what was essentially limited and what was essentially unlimited remained absolutely unclear, right? So therefore, what was limited was not. How do you distribute it? That the idea that the irrational and rational, the state and society is rational, the individual and its soul created by God is irrational in that sense, right? The irrational man, the irrational actor, the act is rational, and that rationality is imposed on the irrational, and therefore order and structure is done, right? And however, in other words, paved the way for the complete rationalization of the social order. But the principle of distribution among what was essentially limited and what was essentially unlimited, this was not clear. The state was essentially limited, was a rationalist construct. The individual is what it was substantially. The individual is what was substantially given, the thing that was unlimited in that sense. And Locke's rather unsystematic statements, which are difficult to reconcile with his metaphysics, the effect that emulates from Puritan Christendom is still strong enough to elevate beyond any doubt the concrete and substantial individuality with all its pre-stately rights, freedom, and power. Now, Schmitt is saying, listen, Locke system, there was an inconsistency. His unsystemic statements were hard to reconcile about the limited power in this. It was difficult to reconcile with his metaphysics. The effect that emulated from the Christian Puritanism was still strong enough to elevate any doubt at the concrete and substantial individuality with all its pre-stately freedom of this. This the kind of implication that Hobbes was after, one derived from mathematics and from natural law, forced him to abstract from all concrete context. By that move, the individual was stripped of his concrete individuality. Two, but, and here we find the same systemic idea as in Spinoza. If the individual is nothing but the universal is the whole for him, the whole, Leviathan, becomes the substantial bearer of all rights. In other words, the Leviathan becomes the substantial bearer for all rights. It becomes the new whole. Rousseau's formula is as follows: everyone is subject. Every one of us subjects her person and her entire wealth communally under the sovereign's guidance of the collective will. And in return for this, she is accepted by the community as an indivisible member of the whole. Okay, this is that line, and this is the French. Each of us pulls his person and all his powers under the supreme direction of the general will. We receive embody each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Right. Each one of us place her person and her powers in combination with the others under the supreme control of the general will, which, as one body, receive each member as an invisible part of the whole. Volume 1, Book 6, paragraph 10, right? Section 10. And the similarity of this formula with that of Hobbes and de Civi, Book 7, Chapter 7, has been remarked upon many times. I have even called it a literal copy in which the sovereign of the Leviathan is substituted by a general will, right? A general will. Alter's The Essay on the History of Social Contract Doctrines. Nimes, 1906. Rousseau's starting point may well be individualistic, but after all, everything depends upon what is to happen to the whole made up of individuals. It will absorb all social content and become essentially unlimited. Or the will of individuals retain some concrete substance? In other words, what will it do? Will everything be absorbed and therefore become essentially limited? Or will the will retain some concrete substance, right? Or will the individual retain some concrete substance? Rousseau referred to the totality that issues from the social contract as a common I with its own life and will. This collective entity has received everything that is owned by every individual in order to give it back, so that each individual owns it lawfully. Book 1, Chapter 6 of the Social Contract. Subsequently, the I exercises a kind of absolute power, absolute power, pouvoir absolute, Book 2, Chapter 4, Paragraph 1, over every individual, just as a human being exercises absolute power over the members of his or her body. The sovereign does not recognize an individual as such. Book 2, Chapter 4, Verse 8. For him, everything is leveled. In other words, not the individual, but everything is collective. Everything is leveled. Every social association within the state, every party, and every estate is unjustified. So therefore, only individuals, and therefore all collective in that sense. No intermediate structures. One has to take away from a human being her entire existence, all life and all force, in order to return it to her from the state. Book 2, Chapter 7, Verse 3. Everything that is demanded by the unity sociale, the social unity, is legitimate. even if it concerns religious convictions. So therefore, everything's demanded by this social unity in this sense is by convictions. Book 4, chapter 8:17. This is even this is the civil religion chapter, I think, right? Yeah. Civil religion. And every form of dependence on everything other than the state is something that has been taken from the state. So therefore, everything in other words, every form of dependence on anything other than the state is something that has been taken away from the state. Book 2, chapter 11, paragraph 1. But the question of whether the collective I of the state gains a meaning that absorbs the individual or not is directed less by such assertions than by the idea by such assertions than by the idea of the collective will, than by the idea of a volonté générale, the collective will, which is not born by an individual but an all-embracing unity. So, what is going on here? In other words, there's no it's the only thing that's created is this general will that's collective in aggregation. Is it a collective entity? So therefore, this is why this is a contradict. This is why it's kind of a problem in that sense, right? Again, but the question whether the collective I of the state gains the meaning that absorbs individuals or not is directed less by the assertion about the general will, right? Which is not born by an individual, but by the all-embracing unity. So that the general will is this all-embracing unity, the state. The volonté générale, the general will, is the essential concept in Rousseau's philosophical construction of the state. It is the will of the sovereign, and it constitutes the state as a unity. In this respect, it displays a conceptual quality that distinguishes it from any particular individual will. In collective will, what is always coincides. So what is sorry in collective will, in the collective will, in a collective will. I think there's a missing art there. In a collective will, what is always coincides with what should rightfully be. So, in other words, in a collective will, what is coincides with what should rightfully be. Just as power and right are unified in God, and according to the concept of God, whatever he wills is always good, and the good is always his true will. So too sovereignty, la volonté générale, the general will, appears in Rousseau as something that, though its mere existence is always just, what it must be is always just what it must be. In other words, even though its mere existence, it is always just what it must be. In other words, okay, not justice. What is always just in terms of just what it must be. In other words, is what it must be. I don't like that word just there. It's not trying to say always just. It's always just. In other words, its mere existence is always what it must be. Is always just what it must be. I want to see the German. I don't have my German edition yet. I'm suspicious of the translation because it may mislead us. That its mere existence is always is always what it must be, just what it must be. I mean, at this moment, what it and just here is not just in virtues, but meaning specifically is always specifically what it must be. Le souverain parla cela et que est toujours toi écrit droit inter. So let's go look at this. Let's look at the French. Google. The sovereign by that alone is he that is always that, that he should be. He is like God. I am what I should. I am that I am. I am that I am from God's burning bush. I am what I should be. Right? I am what I am. Right. This idea, the sovereign, the sovereign, just by virtue of being. Again, the translator is. I don't think it's just by virtue. It's not just. Again, just by virtue means alone, by merely by virtue. I think I would have. I think the German is going to be merely. Something like merely means merely specific, not just, because just is a justness may lead you here. This is I'm getting annoyed by the translation now. Finally, because as I read this more closely, I can see how the translation is kind of skewing things. And the he she crap that's there is very politically correct nonsense. Um, the sovereign, just by virtue of being, always is what it should be. Book one of volume one, book one of social contracts, chapter 7, line 5. The volontaire general is always right. This general will is always right. The right, the right. Book two, chapter 6, line 10. It cannot err. Book 2, chapter 3. And uh, it is it is reason itself in relation to which it is determined with the same necessity by which natural law governs the physical world. Book 2, chapter 4, paragraph 4, or line 4, or whatever. I think it's paragraph 4 in that sense. It is imperishable, unchangeable, and pure. Book 4, chapter 1. By contrast, individual will, law, voluntaire, particular is null and void. Book 3, chapter 2, line 6. So the individual will, the particular will, right? La particular, the particular will. The particular is null and void. A particular act, a particular will, a particular interest, any particular dependency to Book 2, chapter 11, 1, any particular force, and any particular concern, Book 3, chapter 15, line, paragraph 8, line 8, or section 8. I think the line, paragraph 8 maybe. Let me just check this for a second. I'm just a little worried about something. Okay, then, and Arab number chapter and the number separated from a full stop. In other words, the number separated from it from a full stop indicates the passage. So what passage? That's the passage. So okay, so it's period passage. Let's do this comparison by unit. In other words, let's do this whole line again. A particular act, a particular will, particular interest, any particular dependency to chapter 1, a particular force, particular concerning book 3, chapter 15, you know, paragraph 8, or is in itself insignificant by comparison with the unity and supremacy of the general will. As in Hobbes' use of the word private, particular is almost a derogatory term. So again, like Hobbes' use of private is derogatory. Rousseau's use of particular is almost a derogatory term. The volunteer general is elevated to the dignity of the divine. It abolishes every particular will. Compared to it, all particular interests seem to be theft. Therefore, the question of the inviolable rights of the individual and of the private sphere protected from the encroachment of the sovereign volunteer general will can no longer be raised. In other words, so therefore the logic. If you follow the logic here, then this is the totalitarian. You can argue for totalitarian. This is where the. If you understand it this way, this is why there's no. Once you have the general will, there's nothing particular has any legitimacy towards it. This again. This is the very. He's reading it very just Rousseau read this way. Once you understand it dogmatically and strictly, that there can be no that abolishes every particular will compared to it. All the particular interests are seen to be theft, and that's it, because they're illegitimate, private, particular. Everything's been destroyed, as he says here, right there, right? Therefore, the question of inviolable rights of the individual in the private sphere protected from the encroachments of the sovereign of a general will, the voluntary general, can no longer be raised. That's because it's illegitimate. That's it. The question is eliminated by the simple alternative that the individual either is identical with the general, uh, um, and then it has value in the virtue of this identity, or is not identical, and then it is null and void, evil, corrupt, and overall. It does not represent a will that has to be respected in a moral or legal sense. So therefore, if it agrees with this, in other words, if the will agrees with this, then it's fine. If it's in disagreement, then it's an error, and therefore does not have it's null and void. In other words, the question is eliminated by the simple alternative that an individual either is identical with the general, the individual is identical to that what the general will dictates, or if it isn't, then then it's what it's not, he's an error. It's an error. He's an error of it. He's not. And therefore, as an individual will, as an individual, as mere private will, it is null and void, evil, corrupt, and overall, it does not represent a will that has to be respected in a moral and legal sense. The division of powers and the intermediary powers, right? The pouvoirs intermediate powers, had a practical purpose to break the power of the state through a system of mutual obstructions and limiting responsibilities, and therefore to protect the freedom of the individual. In the case of the voluntary general will, which alone presented the dignity of the true reality, it would not make sense to talk about a separation of powers. Rousseau dismissed it with a joke about the Japanese magician who cuts a child into pieces and then let her appear again as a whole. A joke about a Chinese which cuts up the child and then the child then lets the child appear again as a whole. And he was in fact influenced by the suggested effect of the simile of the balance. Right? He was in fact he was influenced by the simile, the suggestive effect of the simile of the balance. Volume 1, book 1, chapter 8, paragraph section 2, book 2, not section, but passage 2, book 2, chapter 6, passage 10, book 3, chapter 8, passage 10, book 4, chapter 6, passage 3. But sovereignty itself is superior to such theories. So therefore, sovereignty itself is. He was incensed by this wonderful theory of balance. It was like this in these post passages. But sovereignty itself is superior to such theories. The government or administration can be nothing but the execution of the general will, and this is their only justification. The entire activity of the executive is put into a simple relation. In other words, the entire activity of the executive is put into a single relation to the general legal proposition, as in Locke, with the sole difference that Rousseau, unfortunately, did not take into account international relations. The analysis of which prompted Locke to the construction of federative power, Book 3, Chapter 15, chapter, passage 12 in the note. The government, the government of or le prince, the government or le prince has to execute the laws. It represents the powers that covert the wills of the laws into action, the laws of arms, la force appellate de la law, right? The words, the force applied to the laws. In other words, the will of the law and action, the arm of the law, the force applied to the laws. Book 3, Chapter 15, uh, eight, eight sentence, right? Uh, Entry, right? Only the volunteer general will, the legislation, is by nature an inalienable concern of the people, whereas the executive can fall into the province of a single person, of a few, or again, all the people. So of a single person, of a few, or of people. As a result, the state is either a monarchy or aristocracy or democracy. Book 2, Chapter 1. Within a monarchical composed executive, there are then intermediate classes, like the nobility, which can be useful in a large state. Book 3, Chapter 6, fifth passage. The particular attributes which Rousseau endows the general will, correctness, indestructibility, moral purity, combined with other necessary preconditions, and give it a manifold meaning, a manifold meaning. Initially, this will is general in regard to its subject, as the will of the collective. It stems from all. Elle partitur. She leaves everyone. Okay. It stems from all. It leaves everyone. Right. This does not mean that the common will is the sum total of all singular private will. So it's not a sum total. That would be impossible because, as its concept indicates, it is opposed to everything private, anything individual. Right? That is particular, everything particular, and that is opposed to everything particular, private, individual. It is something that everyone owns not as a private person, but as a citizen. Book 1, Chapter 7, 7, and Book 2, Chapter 4. So that's one thing. It's not, in the words, it's the general will is just something that they all share as a citizen. It is not a collection of private will. It's not a sum. Secondly, the general will, is general by virtue of its aim at the general. That is the common interest, l'utilité publique, the public utility, or the bien general, the common good, the general good, the, the common good. Book 2, Chapter 4, sorry. This general interest is something other than the sum total of private interest. So it's something common they said is not merely the sum total of private interest. Though correct distribution and equality of living conditions, however, it will normally coincide with the interest of all, taken individually. But when parties and coalitions within the state create group interests, the common will be distorted. Book 2, Chapter 3, third sentence. So therefore, yes, this is true individually, but once you have groups, once you have subordinate intermediate interests, then it becomes distorted. Thirdly, the common will is a voluntary a general will, in the sense of being general. It's shared by all. That is, it cannot concern itself with any individual case. It cannot make an individual distinction. It cannot recognize any particular or extraordinary right. It cannot make any concrete decision. So therefore, it must be something. Everything applies to everyone. Like us, in other words, the general will that it must be something that deals with the general case. It cannot be anything particular, anything specific, anything individual. It cannot recognize any privilege or extraordinary right. It cannot even make a concrete decision. Here it is the abstract concept of law, characteristic of the 18th century, that dominates, in contrast to the practical and sober meaning that Montesquieu was giving to the general characteristic of the legal norm. So anyway, this is the difference. This is very interesting. Rousseau makes an abstract. Rousseau's concept of general turns to the idea of law, the idea of universality of form of the law, right? In other words, here it is the abstract concept of law characterized in the 18th century that dominates like this, in contrast to the practical and sober meaning That monarchy was given to the general characteristic of legal norm. Law is universal, like the I don't want to get this word wrong. Oh, that's okay. It's not found. Yuck. Dictionary, the rational dictionary, like the dictionary rationalis, the rational dictation, rational, like the rational dictation. It is the law of reason, the law de raison, which should conform exactly to the law of nature, the natural law of nature, Book 2, Chapter 4 and 4. Of these attributes, if these attributes are realized, if the will is general in its subject as well as its object, and its factual reality, Tabbesband, this is thing that is that. Let's say what this says. A fact of the case, the fact of the case, then law is thereby grounded as right. It is not just a general guideline or a regulative idea, but rather the principle that constitutes the legal character of an ordinance and transforms a mere factual order into a legal proposition with legally binding consequences. Let's repeat this. This is a very important point that Schmitt's bringing up. This is the 18th century conception of this idea of shapes here. If these attributes are realized, if the will is general, its subject as well as in its object, and its factual reality, the facts of the case, then the law is thereby grounded as right. It is not just a general guideline or a regulative idea, but rather the principle that constitutes the legal character of an ordinance and transforms it to mere factual order into a legal proposition with legally binding consequences. If these attributes are absent, then no right exists, and then the process that matters to transform power into right has not been achieved, nor is it achievable through a representation of a common. Nor is it achievable through a representation of a commonwealth. In fact, the fact that a corporation, a parliament, elected according to any suffrage, be it even absolutely democratic, should, as such, express its will as the will of the state, can perhaps be explained through historic reasons or practical consideration. But none of this constitutes a justification. So, the fact that a corporation, a parliament elected according to any suffrage, even if it's democratic, should as such express its will as the will of the state, can perhaps be explained through historic reasons or practical consideration. But none of this constitutes a justification. Therefore, a private entity, a corporation entity, a body, a representative body can claim this. It may be historically, it may make sense, but it does not constitute a justification. The general will, the volontaire general, carries with it a certain quality of value, which either exists or do not exist. The implication of this statement can abolish democracy. The implication of the statement can abolish democracy, because one has to note that, according to the contract social, the volontaire general is independent of the form of government. It is part of its nature to be the will of the collective, but the single individual can be mistaken about their own true will. Their will can also be governed by passions and hence not be their free will. At this point, the classic Stoic tradition will come into effect, even in Rousseau. It becomes evident that the social contract is not a Rousseauesque or romantic piece of work. that the traditional domains that the traditional domains of the rational faculty over irrational has not yet been overturned. In other words, that the traditional domination of irrational faculty over the irrational effects has not been overturned. As a human being who has been corrupted should be restored once more to a condition corrupted should be restored once more to a condition of human dignity by the state. Any force naturale, any natural power must disappear. In other words, and moral existence must replace purely natural one. Book 2, Chapter 4. It is, if it is possible, even for the true will of the majority of civil citizens to be suppressed by the egoistic will of passions, be it from a moral or legal perspective, then it is also possible for a minority or even a single person to possess true will. So therefore, in other words, it doesn't matter. What matters is being a true will. Being its, in other words, the will must collect must be identical. So a majority can be led by passion, and by their passion can be what? Misled, and being misled is no longer agreeing with the general will. Whereas the one person or a few people who are true, their wills are in conformity with the general will, that correct in that sense, right? This is what he's saying here. And therefore, this is why it echoes the of this. Therefore, be it a moral or legal perspective, then it is even possible for a minority or even a single person to possess the true will. For Rousseau, there is only one country in Europe where the preconditions for the true legislator are given. Corsica, volume 2, chapter 10, verse 5, chapter 10, verse 6. For entry, sentence, or whatever. For the ideal form of government, direct democracy, rare preconditions are needed. Simple overview of all relations, simple customs, and material abstinence. These are the elements that seldom apply, so that the perfect form of government is suitable for gods but unsuitable for human beings. Book 3, chapter 4, paragraph or section 8, entry 8. The reservation implicit in all that, which makes the social contract such an ambiguous book, consists in the fact that Rousseau talks about the will of all and the numerical unanimity, book 4, chapter 2, 8, and about the will of the majority, and about the common interest that one should identify by counterbalancing contrary interest, book 2, chapter 3, paragraph 2. Yet, in spite of all of this, the will, the interest, the people are moral and not just factual entities. Not just fact, they're moral entities. If a slavish people not even unanimously proves the existence of a volunteer general, book 4, chapter 2, line 3, when people are good, they only need to rise up and grasp their freedom. If they are corrupt, their relation with the tyrant remains purely, in other words, if corrupt, their relationship with the tyrant remains purely factual. And whether they revolt or not is neither here nor there. They have no right to stage a revolution. In other words, if they're corrupt. Only the statement that the people, that is, the government, as opposed to the governed, are good by nature, hence good under all circumstances, and by definition, a sentence that was taken from the other writings of Rousseau, but not from the contract social, transforms the whole system created by Rousseau's work with its abstract constructions into a revolutionary ideology. So, in other words, this idea, the idea that there's a universal good, human beings are a universal good, this is completely absent in Rousseau. So you get an abstract system in Rousseau. With social contract, you get an abstract system. You don't get a belief of the evolutionary ideology in the social contract. It is by adding something that's not in the text, Schmitt is saying, that of this idea of the natural goodness of man, which is again taken from, I would argue, the first discourse, right? The first discourse, and imposed into the social contract, into the contract social, that just transforms the whole system created by Rousseau. It's into a work with its abstract constructions into a revolutionary ideology. For all the talk about freedom, this kind of freedom does not stem from the practical, rational longing for security and comfort, as it does in the English theorists and in Montesquieu. It rather bears the pathos of virtue, of excellence, of virtu. Um, Only the one who is morally good is free and has the right to speak in the name of the people and to identify with them. The further consequence is that only the one who possesses virtue is entitled to be part of the decision making process on political issues. The political foe is morally corrupt, a slave who must be made innocuous. So therefore, this is a radical position. In other words, only the one who is morally good and free has the right to speak in the name of the people and identify with them. The future consequence is only the one who possesses virtue is entitled to be part of the decision-making process. The political foe is morally corrupt, a slave who must be made innocuous. If it appears that the majority is prone to corruption, then a virtuous minority can use all means of force in order to establish virtue. The terror it exercises cannot be even once called the terror it exercises cannot even once be called coercion. It is only the means to help the free egoist, to recognize his own free will, to awaken the citizen in him. So therefore, terror is not even coercion. It is the means to awaken the individual. Wow, this is radical. The contract social, in which social contract, in which direct self-government of a free people is promulgated as an inalienable right, is a fundamental axiom. Hence, it serves as justification for dictatorship and provides the formula for the despotism of freedom. So, in other words, the social contract in which direct self-government of a free people is promulgated as an inalienable right is a is a fundamental axiom. Hence, it serves as justification for dictatorship and provides the formula for for the despotism of freedom. The most radical pathos of freedom combines with a ruthless and practical suppression of the enemy. But this is just a practical and not a moral suppression. The contradiction between right and power, which has been leveled against the ruling power by the suppressed right, now serves the virtuous minority as a contradiction between right and majority. So, in other words, the most radical pathos combines freedom. The pathos of freedom combines with the ruthless and practical suppression of the enemy. But this is just a practical, not a moral suppression in that sense, right? So not suppressing their morals, it's practical suppression in a sense. The contradiction between right and power, which has been leveled against the ruling power by the suppressed right, now serves a virtuous minority as a contradiction between right and majority. Rousseau has undertaken to show how it is possible to have a state in which not one single person is enslaved. The practical answer was that the enslaved have to be eliminated. Oof. The practical answer is the slave had to be eliminated. The justification is given in the sentence formulated by Rousseau himself. In certain circumstances, human beings must be forced to be free. On le force d'estat libre, he will be forced into freedom. Book 1, Chapter 7, Like, hey, Rousseau does not call this a rule of virtue dictatorship, virtue, a rule of virtue of virtue dictatorship. Does not call this. He follows tradition and restricts the word to the idea of a constitutional, legitimate, extraordinary empowerment of a short duration, designed to resolve a state of emergency. So Rousseau does not change the word, doesn't call it a virtue dictatorship. He just keeps the traditional legal framework. Well-known phrases about dictatorship can also be found in Rousseau. It is interesting in the interest of this security and the um, public order. Extraordinary means are necessary in extraordinary circumstances. Law must not be unbending, inflexible, such that their bureaucratic formalities may become detrimental when there is immediate danger. The lawmaker must foresee that he cannot foresee everything. In short, these are the statement taken partly from Aristotle's teaching on epicatus, equitas, fairness, and also reiterated by Locke. In other words, that the problem of Locke, the problem of law. This is book three about the law. The law cannot do equity. Law cannot address individual cases. Right? Locke also does this case, right? The dictator dominates. The dictator dominates. Dominia. Book 4, chapter 6, 4. The law without representing the dominates. The law without representing the legislature. It doesn't. This statement catches one eye because, according to Rousseau, the volunteer general cannot be represented at all. In other words, that according to Rousseau, the general oil cannot be represented at all. During dictatorship, laws are dormant. The dictator can silence laws but cannot make them speak, and the like. Rousseau's elaboration hints at the same results as those of Malbry, and even if they come from another direction. Rousseau distinguishes between the two types of dictatorship: a general dictatorship in which the laws are silenced, and another one which is characterized by the fact that the responsibilities bestowed by the existing laws are centralized. In other words, a concentration of responsibility occurs within the executive without any changes being made to the normal legal system. According to Rousseau, this second improper type of dictatorship would have emerged around the famous formula, um, uh, Evidenza and consola in a Republica. And so the consul should take care that the republic may not suffer damage, right? The consuls, those let the consuls see, lest the commonwealth suffer loss, right? Suffer damages. Let the conference see that let the consul should take care that the republic may not suffer damage. And it is far from yielding its unlawful space for concrete measures of any kind of general dictatorship. In other words, it's not going to allow it to. In other words, it won't allow as far as from unyielding and unlawful space for concrete measures of any kind, as general dictatorship does. There is no need to examine the accuracies of Rousseau's historic views. The truth is that the Senate Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, with its formal Vetat Consul, the consul should see that, was used because the old dictatorship no longer had a dramatic effect. It suffered through the history of inflation, right, which was due to the frequent use in periods of civil wars when it was needed to maintain the power of the Senate, right? So, therefore, the only thing of interest is that his distinction suggests an opposition between dictatorship and state of siege. and the state of siege, an opposition generated in the process of shifting the entire executive power. In other words, in other words, so between dictatorship and the state of siege, an opposition generated in the process of shifting the entire executive power. The legal protection guaranteed through the regulation and limitation of responsibility will be completely ignored, while extremely summary process with the circumvention of all proper institutional channels will not be regarded as a dictatorship, because nothing has changed as far as the general will is concerned. Only the executive is there. In other words, only within the executive is there an acceleration, intensification of the force with which one and the force with the one and the same old law is executed. Right? So only in the executive, and that's the problem. Therefore, general dictatorship only exists within a temporary suspension of the entire legal system is in play. The entire legal system is in place. So therefore, it's general. Rousseau does not explain clearly what is the legal foundation for defining this lawless condition. He does not seize the opportunity to develop a dialectics of the legal system that annuls itself. The general will applies without exception and universality, given that it is by nature general. It is logically impossible to give an explanation of its substance. That it should not hold for a specific defined period. Okay, that it should not hold for any specific defined period, or be applied with regard to particulars of a concrete situation, or to announce a concrete situation. In other words, it's always going to be there. So there's no without exception, given that it is by general nature. It's logically impermissible that now these, in other words, that it should not hold for that defined period of time, or be applied in regard to particularities of certain concrete situations, or to announce a concrete exception. Right. This might be the reason why the chief supreme, the highest commander, is the one who is in charge of public security. Suspends the authority of law. The chief supreme is the one who does this, supports the authority of law. Such a mandate must be either a general delegation or a particular act. How general will suspends itself in a case of emergency is a mystery. Even more so is the question of where an executive organ should get the authority for such a suspension. So that's a contradiction. Where does this? If the general will is what he says it is, the logic of that, where does the actor get who? How can a mandate must be? In other words, how can an executive organ get set authority for such a decision? Given the rigorously held views that the executive has nothing to do except execute the law, it follows that this authority can never be claimed. Obviously, for Rousseau, appointing a dictator is an act performed by an executive. Nevertheless, he gives an explanation that alludes to the voluntary general by saying that unquestionably the intention of the people's intention, will appear to be the same as the general will, goes towards protecting the existence of the state and preventing its downfall. For according to Rousseau, the context of the dictator's actions is purely factual. His agency is not associated with legislature, so therefore it's a factual decision, particular thing. Its legal basis is not constructed, but it is important that it's called a commission. So in other words, again, let's look at this. Nevertheless, it gives an explanation that alludes to this voluntary will by saying that it's the intention of the people, which appears to be the same as this. Right? It goes towards protecting the existence of the state and preventing the downfall. Again, according to Rousseau, the content of the dictator's action is factual. His agency is not associated with the legislature. Okay, so it's not legislative. It does not come from. Its legal basis is not constructed, but it is important that it is called a commission. So it's called a commission. It's called this, but it's not constructed as. Rousseau calls dictatorship the important commission, an important commission. The concept of commission is a tacit but basic notion of Aristotle's theory of the state. It's an expression of the idea that, with respect to the state, there are only duties and no rights. More precisely, that every exercise of sovereign right can only be done in a commissarial manner. Therefore, right can be there can only duties. There are only duties and no rights. And more precise, that every exercise of sovereign rights can only be done in a commissarium through law, through the instruments of law, through the instruments of this right, the institution, commissarial manner. In a true democracy, the office must not be a right. It must not even go in any sense to the advantage of the person who occupies it. It should remain a costly duty. Book 4, chapter 3, fourth sentence, fourth paragraph. True, the government is a intermediate body, corpus intermediary. So the government is between the people as sovereign and the people as subject. Book 3, chapter 1, fifth sentence, fifth entry. But this phrase is only used as a metaphor for the mediation involved in applying the general will to the concrete case. It should not be taken to suggest the legal autonomy of the mediating corp facing the sole commanding authority, the general will. So this is the danger here. This is Schmitt. I mean, Schmitt is reading Rousseau very logically, very consistently, and very dominant in this idea that therefore he's using the metaphor of this, but this cannot be true. This cannot be the case. Why? Let's go back. He says because what? But this phrase can only be used as a metaphor for the mediation to imply this for a concrete case. It should not be taken as just a legal or moral autonomy of a mediating court facing the sole commanding authority. Remember, nothing. Everybody said before that nothing particular. An intermediating body is a particular body. It's particular. It's a particular. It's a collective thing. It's a particular. And being particular, it has it's null and void and contrasted to the general will. Right. Hence, it is used. It is used in a complete different sense from the one it has in Montesquieu, because it is intermediary. Because it is intermediately emphasized that the legal relationship in which this government or the prince and the people are embedded is generally not a contract, right? It is absolutely nothing but a commission. So the government, and that's not a contract; it's a commission in that sense. Commission of that. In other words, the government in that sense is merely a commission. It is not a contract. It has no binding. It is at any moment revocable at the discretion of the sovereign, whose minister, agents, and commits, ambassador, is the prince. Book 3, chapter 1. Goethe, in his exposition of the history of the idea of the contractual basis of the state, his book on Althusis, page 95, has emphasized that the decisive step in Rousseau's construction consists in eliminating the contract between the prince and the people, and in making the social and consensual contract among the citizens, the vox-genos, the citizens, the only principle of unity of the people. A further contract of domination or subjugation between the government and the people is no longer required. But it is not sufficient to point out that the contract of domination is absent here. In other words, it's not sufficient to point out the contract of domination, this Hirschschwinge, is absent here. Whether the content of the contract of the state was negotiated as a definite assessment or as a delegation of the people's function to rule, or it was just relinquished for use or through commissio imperia, imperial concessions of power by the people to the prince or the government. It was always a mutual contract on the basis of what the prince was granted, a mutual contract on the basis of which the prince was granted certain rights. According to Goethe, Althuis's audacity and originality consists in having applied the absolute concept of sovereignty to sovereignty of the people in all its potency. Yet one has to bear in mind that the mutual contractus reciprocus, the mutual contract, subsists in altruis too, and this contract is binding even outside the state, in conformity with the principles of natural law, and it creates a multitude. It creates a multitude of visum, a multitude of liabilities between the prince and the people, between the mandatee and the mandateer and the mandatees. So the one who mandating, one is mandated. The prince and the people, liabilities, mutual liabilities, obligations unto them. Joseph's Athus's Politica methods of the Politica, the politics methodologically sorted out. Um, um, in particular, chapter 19, which is on the commission of the kingdom or the universal government. Arthurus, it talks about a commission regni, a commission of king, or a commission of sovereignty, commissiona regina, commission of royalty, of sovereignty, but only in the general sense of the transferal. Patum agreement is a bilateral agreement of mandating that defines the mandator's rights. So therefore, the one who's mandating his rights. When Pufendorf refers to the clausa commissaria, or the commissary conclusion, in order to construct a restricted monarchy, and says that in this instant, wherever the prince does not conform to its terms or conditions, he has lost legitimate power. He has acquired upon accepting his rule. All of this is also based on the idea of mutual binding contract, right? The idea of contract. There's this contract. Samuel Pufendorf on the natures of the justice of nature and the nations, in his books, the laws of nature and of nations, peoples. Even if, as Gurka wants, page 88, one has to assume a pure contract of civil servants, the people are constrained by natural law. The prince who exercises his supreme, some conclusion, okay, on exercises regime under the conditions that he has commanded piously and justly, which then is translated under the condition that he has a condition he has exercised his rule with piety and justice. According to Althus, he has a valid claim to his position as long as he really governs p governs at unjustly. In other words, governs with piety and justice. He governs piety faithfully and just. As long as he's being faithful and just, he has a right to govern. By contrast, in Rousseau, the concept of the sovereign people does not invoke any right. When Realm claims from this that by abolishing the contract of government and by founding the functions of the supreme state organ on a one-sided act of the state, Rousseau returns to Marcellus of Padua and Nicholas of Corsa. He completely misunderstands the essence of the commissarial exercise of office. So fiercely rejected by the enemies of papal plenitude of potence. And they misunderstand this idea. In other words, he turns it to the supreme state organ, and therefore they think the state is absolute power. He turns this function to the state function, but no, it is a realm misunderstands. He completely misunderstands the essences of the commissarial exercise of office. So fiercely rejected by enemies of the papal plenitude of this. And there was the essence of that commissary officers. The concept of commissar stemming from the concept of commissar stemming from an absolutism that contradicts the medieval conception of law as well as the natural law of justice is applied in Rousseau to the relationship between the prince and the people, except that, conversely, the prince becomes the commissar. So that was not possible in this. In other words, he says that in Rousseau, except the concept of commissar stemming from the absolutism that contradicts the medieval conception of law and that justice is applied to the relationship between the prince and the people, except that conversely, the prince becomes the commissar. There is here no self-binding of the sovereign through law, not even the contract of civil servants practiced in constitutional law today. In other words, there's no binding of this state action, no binding of sovereign will can do everything. In other words, he's talking about German law that the contracts of civil service binds the contract of a civil service practice in constitutional law is something that binds. No, not even that. What people do and wish is subject to his will. The person who is working on behalf of the realization of the people's will can only act as a commissarial matter. In other words, what people do and wish is subject to his will. The person who is working on behalf of the realization of the people's will can only act in a commissarial manner. There is neither a delegation nor a representation of this will, and even less a right to exercise it. There's no exercising it. He just has to know what it is, and then he's doing what the will says. The representatives and the duties of the representatives and deputies of the people, when they exist, are no more are no more than commissaries. Book 3, chapter 15. Book 3, chapter 15. So the representatives and people, deputies, are nothing more than commissaries. They're not nothing more. There ought to be some representation in the executive power, but the executive is just the arm of the law. It has no will of its own, and it is in essence only a commission too. So the executive is a commission as well. What is valid for the princely commissar also holds for all these individuals. So the commissar, but also these other representative agents of this. What is valid for the princely commissar also holds for these individuals. Their representational status ceases when the person represented. Their representation is the one who places the one in whose place they act. Takes turns, desires to step in, so that the one that knows that they once the in other words once the people that they're acting or representing decide the thing that they want to do, take act, then their status is removed. So that what is valid for a prince comes always as the individual. Their representative status ceases when the person represented, the one who they take the place, desire to step in. Nothing proves Rousseau's belief in the absolutism of the state more than this. The transformation, which dominates all his ideas of the entire institutional activity of the state into an arbitrary, irrevocable, and unconditional dependence on commissarial operations. So therefore, this is the idea of this. This nothing proves his universal belief in the absolutism of the state. Is that is a transformation which dominates all his ideas of the entire institution activity of the state into an arbitrary, regular, and unconditionally dependent commissarial option. The prince and likewise the delegate of the people and the dictator are therefore commissars. The dictator dictates to the outside world, but insofar as he's a commissar, he himself must internally be directed. He must internally be directed to. In other words, he he himself must be dictated to. Dictated to. Whereas even though he's dictating outside, he is a commissar. He must be dictated to. Now there appears in the contract social another interesting figure who is telling connections with respect to Rousseau's concept of dictatorship has been overlooked before. The legislator, book 2, chapter 7. Both legislator and dictator are somehow extraordinary, unusual. But according to Rousseau, the legislature is posited outside and prior to the Constitution, whereas dictatorship is a constitutionally defined suspension of the existing legal system. For Rousseau, the legislature is not a commissar. Judging by the context of this task, he's identical with the typical lawmaker of the 18th century, a wise and eminent person whose spirit fixes the machine of the state and propels it forward. Indeed, in Rousseau, the lawmaker bears a misleading name because the most important aspect of his function is that it does not give him legislative capacity. He only has a manner of initiating laws, and not even in this sense of having a right. In other words, he only has a manner of initiating laws, and not even in that sense of having the right to propose. He outlines the prudent laws, but the sanction comes only from the voluntary general will. Rousseau says in Book 2, Chapter 7, line 7, verse 7, entry 7, that one can find out in the first instance whether the legislature has proposed is indeed the voluntary general will or not, if a free vote, a kind of referendum, has been held. The decision rests with the people, and not only in a superficial juridic sense, but also in the sense that it is a decision as to whether the voluntary general will is all with all its constitutional equalities exists or not. Rousseau emphasizes this heavily. This generates a very particular confusion with Rousseau, which Rousseau himself has perceived as a difficulty, a problem. Book 2, chapter 7, 9. Human beings, as he observes, are on the whole egoistic and are only concerned with their own particular advantage. And they need to become good through the very same wise law that is subject to their own ballot. In other words, that they need to be good through the very same wise law that is subject to their own ballot. In other words, it must, they should, whatever they vote on, they should be forced to agree to. It follows, as Rousseau put it, that there must be an authority of a completely different kind to which the legislature can appeal, namely a divine mission. He thus dictates his law on the basis of inspiration. Now the question arises, by what means does the legislature prove his mission? The Protestant monarchomarchs, who in extreme cases admitted that someone awakened by God, revolted and usurped the exceeding authority, were confronted with the question of how the elected one can legitimate himself. And they answered by demanding a divine sign and a miracle from the elected one. Even Rousseau is talking about a miracle, but a very humanized one. It is not overwhelming. It is not an overwhelming event, but a philosophically great soul, un grand ame, a great soul. Book 2, chapter 7, verse 11. Verse of chapter, paragraph 11, whatever it is. Though that Rousseau, through that, says Rousseau, both his mission and his perdinence. Okay, not even directionary working. and his pertinence of his, in other words, even though both his mission and his pertinence of his laws are guaranteed. Pertinence. Pertinence. In other words, it's, I think it's that's. I think that's. I hope that's not. I can't find a word. I think it's. Oh, this is going to be 2 hours. I just know it. Hold on. I'm apologizing. Permanence, or in other words, British English. Ugh. Permanence. What a better answer. Oh, permanence. Permanence. The quality of lasting, enduring forever. Oh God, this is the translator here. I wish it was a different translator. The translator is driving me. This translation is driving me absolute bat shit crazy in that sense. Um, in other words, its mission and its permanence of his laws are guaranteed. And of course, but the question is whether this guarantee a positive outcome from the people's ballot. Everything should depend on it, and suddenly it is not mentioned anymore. So it was just suddenly it's not, everything depends on it. So it's mentioned. What happened if the ballot opposes the wise law and the great soul? Rousseau does not examine the possibility. He only repeats that the legislature is someone utterly extraordinary. He is not a magistrate. He's not sovereign. He's not a sovereign, and he's in fact he's a nothing because he himself should first create the state in which such concepts come into being for the first time. Therefore, his own position cannot be deduced from the state that is yet to be constructed. Phew, this is magical misconstrued sense. He goes. Um, the content of the legislature's action, the content of the legislature's action is right, but devoid of legal power, it is powerless right. Dictatorship is omnipotent without law. It is useless power. In other words, dictatorship is omnipotence without law. It is lawless power. Okay, lawless, not useless power, lawless power. Sorry. So again, in context of the legislature's action is right. It is devoid of legal power. It is powerless right. Dictatorship is omnipotence without law. It is lawless power. In fact, that Rousseau was not aware of the antithesis does not mean that it is any less significant. At this point, the contradiction between the powerless right and the lawless power is so extreme that it has turned into its opposite, in other words. So, therefore, what? Powerful lawlessness. In other words, the powerless right turns into lawless power. So, therefore, the extreme of is so extreme that it is turned into its opposite. The legislature stands outside the state, but he is in the right. The dictator stands outside the right, but he is within the state. The legislature is nothing but right that is not yet constituted. The dictator is nothing but constituted power. What the contradictions, right? In other words, the legislature stands outside of the state, but he is right. The dictatorship stands outside of right, but he's within the state. The legislature is nothing but right that is not yet constituted. The dictator is nothing but constituted power. When a relationship emerges that make it possible to give the legislature the power of a dictator, to create a dictatorial legislature and a constitutional dictator, then the commissarial dictatorship has become a sovereign dictatorship. That's the next move. That's the next step, the sovereign dictatorship. In other words, this idea, this contradiction of this thing, merge the two together. So when therefore that it's possible to give the legislator the power of a dictator to create a dictatorial legislature and a constitution, then the commissary dictatorship has become a sovereign dictatorship. This relationship will come. This relationship will come about through as an idea. This relationship will come about through an idea that is, in substance, a consequence of our social contract, although he does not name it as a separate power. In other words, he does not name as a separate power the pouvoir constant, the consulting power. Right. In other words, this relationship will come about through an idea that is, in its substance, a consequence of a social contract, although he does not name as a separate power the consulting power. Right, that's how he ends the chapter. This has been long. I apologize. I thought we'd be quicker through it. If you have any comments, questions, please put it below. If you have any, when I see them, I'll respond to them. I'm gonna feel no one's gonna watch it because it's so long. If you like it, hit the like button, share it with things. If you didn't like it, okay, hit the, can say no, but say what's wrong in the comment. It's too long, way too long. We should make shorter videos. Okay, I'm sorry. We're reading this through very carefully. It's a very powerful thing. Next thing we're going to do is voila. If you have not subscribed, subscribe. If you have, that helped grow the channel some, let's build the channel up a little more. If you haven't done something, please do it. It'll help. Subscribe, please. You can follow me on social media. If you want to follow me on social media, you can follow the links below. If you want to see more about scholarship and my research agendas and things like that, you can see my academic social media links below and things about that. And then another thing you can do is, if you want to help me to do what I do, you can contribute it. You can do so by becoming a member subscribes to our Patreon listed below. By becoming a member of either subscribes to our Patreon, or other way you can help is to buy one of the books that are listed my books that are listed below through either Amazon or any books, Barnes & Noble, or any online bookseller, or through your local bookstore. Again, we're going to post on Mondays and Wednesdays. Usually, Rousseau is being done. I got a feeling that this is going to be much longer videos. I'm scared about this. Next time we look at chapter 4. We're going to be chapter 4, part 1 and part 2, which focuses on this issue, this aspects of this commissarial dictatorship, and that's move to commissarial dictatorship to sovereign dictatorship. Right, looking at, I think, in many sense, looking at some of the theories of this. Or examples of it. So I think he's going to do Cromwell and Diktatur, Robespierre, right? So we'll stop here. Again, this is Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then Fridays always discussion. We have a live chat or some kind of thing like that. Okay, take care. Bye bye. Have a good day. So long.